Hi, well, I was very pleased to accept this invitation until they told me I'd be following Desmond Tutu. Then I desperately tried to find, I don't know, some new government announcements that I desperately had to cover today, which I probably will have to do. As those of you who are based in the UK will know, my normal job is following the BBC political editor, Nick Robinson. And it poses some of the same challenge because you have a lot of sort of lofty vision. But I think this was somewhat worse because he doesn't have quite such a close working relationship with God, and he's not half as funny as Desmond Tutu. So I do feel like we've had the vision and the moral leadership, and now we've got the plumbing. But I don't have to tell this room that the plumbing's actually quite important in the global economy, and we've discovered that only to our cost in the last few years. I'm going to sit down in a minute, and we're going to have a chat with these very fine panelists. I think we're in no danger of covering too little ground with this panel. We have Arkady Dvorkovich, advisor to President Medvedev, and the Russian Sherpa to the G8, and now the G20, which is rapidly coming ahead of the G8. We have Wang, who's the editor of Caixin Media in China and is a very distinguished investigative reporter and editor in China, able to give us his view of the Chinese situation. Agius, who I'm sure many of you know as the group chairman of Barclays, one of the banks to come out of this relatively unscathed, although you had your own near-death experiences, like many of our institutions. And Dennis Turner, chief economist for HSBC here in the UK. So I guess we have two representatives from the BRICS. We have a titan of global banking, and we have old Europe, if Dennis won't mind me referring to him as old Europe in the form of UK Economist. As some of you will be familiar, probably more familiar than I am, with these kind of sessions, I'm going to talk to each of the speakers in turn for a few minutes, sort of serial interview, and then we'll go on to more of a panel discussion and Q&A. So just in case you're nervous that the others aren't getting a look in, they will get a look in a few minutes. But Arkady, if we could just start with you. I mean, we're sort of supposed to be talking about, it's back from the brink. I'm glad that it's still sort of ambiguous whether or not the brink has gone away. I think the world is sort of divided now. If I can mix my metaphors, the world is divided between the people who think we've dodged a bullet and we've gone on, or those who are waiting for something else to happen, and it's more like one of those cartoons where the bullet has been frozen in mid-air while we all try to work out what to do about it and how to get it to go back from where it came from. How do you, just before we sort of go into the Russian situation, given your position in the G20, in the G8, and the negotiations that are going on there, and looking out at the global economy, where do you think we are?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here, and I'm proud to being here with you, and good morning, everyone. I hope I will not be stuck in London with this cloud, but until now I was successful in getting around somehow in this cloud commuting. Well, you can see that BRICS have iPads. Developed countries do not have iPads, so it's a good sign that the balance is changing in the world. I think there was just 1 week when everyone thought it's over. 1 week probably in February, but then it appears that nothing is over. I looked at today's FT, and 3 key headlines are: can the euro survive? Well, who will suffer more? French, Spanish, UK people, Italians. It's not clear. The third question is whether England will get Football World Cup in 2018.
I'm sorry, well, that's the first question. I'm not sure. I'm sure that was higher
I personally think there is just one negative answer for those 3 questions, and this negative answer is for the third question. The first two, I'm optimistic about the first two, but it's clear that the crisis is not over. We are not there yet, and I would say that G20 process was a revolutionary process to some extent, and the fact that different countries sitting around one table, and President Obama actually made a good speech at the first summit he was present at, that he would never think about 2 things. Black can become American president, and such different countries will sit around one table and discuss in one language common challenges. But this discussion is still a discussion. almost no decisions. It was a good decision to act in a coordinated way. But what is happening right now in Europe shows that we are not really doing things in the same way. Coordination is still not good enough. So we are not out of the crisis yet.
I mean, certainly, where would you see the big risks? I mean, I know certainly policymakers here have worried that the biggest risk was the feeling that the crisis had passed, because there was that moment just over a year ago where everyone really did come together and they knew they were looking into the abyss, and there was that exceptional coordination. Now, as you say, even within Europe, people are sort of going their own way. Some countries feel that they have maybe put this behind them.
Two things. One is that if one country does some good things, fiscal discipline, good monetary policies, things like that, and other countries are not doing the same things in a coordinated manner, then there's the clear incentive for the first country not to do things the same way, to protect itself. And this is what is happening right now. Well, we are trying to do right things. We are reducing budget deficit. We are trying to consolidate our fiscal position, and same time, we are afraid about what is going on in Europe. We are afraid that our actions will not be complemented by the same actions of other countries. And when we heard at the previous summit in Pittsburgh that it is too early even to plan for the reduction of budget deficit, even to think how we are going to do this, we were a little bit in a shaky position. We thought that it's time to start doing those things. Otherwise, we can come to the situation where budget deficits will create another wave of crisis. And this is exactly what is happening right now. And the same, another part of the same question is whether governments should already step back with the intervention. We in Russia do not believe that the government is the right instrument to deal with the economy. Business and people right instruments to deal with the economy, not governments. And I think we went too far with the government intervention into the real economy right now.
Well, that's a fair comment on quite a long part of Soviet history, that there's a bit too much intervention.
We have the experience. We know how it is. I'm afraid other countries just don't have enough experience with it.
But just, I mean, on the Russian economy, I mean, there will be, I apologize for seeming rude, but I mentioned the BRICS. There are plenty of people who say Russia shouldn't be the R, it's more sick than brick. What's your response to that? People here thinking about whether Russia really is going to be a player in the next 20 years?
Well, first of all, it's up to Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs to decide who is in the BRIC, who is not in the BRIC. And he created the concept, so he can either stay with this concept or say that it's finished. I think he's still saying that it's not finished, and BRIC is still important. Secondly, if leaders of BRIC get together, so they believe that BRIC, well, I mean, the presidents of Russia, the chairman of China, presidents of Brazil and India, Prime Minister of India, get together and discuss things together and create common position that they follow then in the G20 format. The BRIC exists. And the reform of International Monetary Fund cannot go on without the consolidated BRIC position right now. Well, the economies are different. That's clear. The economies are not the same, and the strengths and weaknesses are not the same. But it's exactly what brings us together. To some extent, we are complementary, and we are big markets. And when people think what the next big market, it's China, India, Russia, and Latin America.
But people do worry. They worry about the rule of law in Russia. They worry about the dependence of the economy so heavily on commodities. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, it's good that people worry. We do worry about those things. Those things are our major concern, and we are not worrying that other people worry about this. We do worry about this because those issues, those challenges are the most important challenges for us, and we have plans how to deal with those things. We have anti-corruption plan. We have the judicial reform plan. We have the plan how to promote innovative economy, to have another part of the economy that is not heavily dependent on the commodity exports. It will not happen overnight, but we have a plan how to do this, and we follow those plans.
What do you think is that, I'm going to be asking everyone this, but what do you really think is the biggest risk facing the world, but also Europe? I mean, I'm struck that you too are joining those who are talking about bringing down budget deficits. Clearly that is a challenge for so many governments, but the fear for those of us who are looking at it, the big picture, if everyone is cutting, if everyone is taking away demand and following the pressure to bring down budget deficits, there is a question where the growth comes from. Are you worried about that?
We understand the concern, but we certainly believe that the developed countries have huge budget expenses on top of what we actually spent during the crisis for anti-crisis purposes. We have, well, some countries have 40% of GDP in fiscal spending, which is a lot. And on top of that, they made another 5% or 10% of anti-crisis spending during the crisis. So it's not about necessarily cutting this extra 5 or 10%. It's about making more efficient the first part, which is much bigger than the anti-crisis spending, and allow the private sector to step in. Budget policy should stimulate private spending rather than substitute private spending. That's a key concept that we are trying to promote right now. And the biggest risk in this situation is that facing the challenges related to inconsistent behavior of some countries, other countries will start closing the doors. Like delinking their national banks from the global banking system by asking banks to put more resources into the national economy, delinking in investment area, in trade, to be on the safe side. But it's a way to nowhere. And we see some signs of this trend, and this is the most dangerous thing at this point.
It's been less than many anticipated. I realize I want to move on to Wang Shuo in a moment, but a very brief one. We're in a time when people are talking about sovereign defaults, and that being the next big concern. It occurs to me that you're the one person, certainly on this panel, but possibly in the room, that has been in a country that has suffered a sovereign default. What's your advice to Greece and the others on that? Good thing, bad thing?
Well, it's a bad thing. It's a loss of reputation, and it takes at least a few years to recover from that.
But you were back in the markets quite soon. I mean, relatively speaking,
well,
you weren't pariahs.
Investors tend to forget about bad things. That's clear. But I'm not sure they. Well, in 1998 we didn't have a global crisis. Now we have a global crisis. In 1998, investors had safe havens. Now investors do not have safe havens. So if they get back from Greece, they will get back from everyone, since they will be afraid that will be the next one to have a default. So it's a much bigger issue right now than we had in 1998. And I think it's about international effort to act against potential sovereign default. We do not have sufficient international capacity to deal with those situations yet, but we are working on that. And certainly it's impossible to do those things in a separated manner. As any other things, we are promoting right now our innovative agenda. We cannot do this on our own. We will try to invite all international companies, companies that are here to participate in our plans. We do not have any chance to do it on our own. The same with sovereign problems of the kind you're talking about.
Wang Shuo, if I could bring you in and to get the perspective from China, I guess the same question to start. I mean, where do you see the situation now? And in particular, people are looking nervously at China. In a way, China emerged in a very, impressed people with a quite statesman-like approach to the crisis, was very much a global citizen, has been a good global citizen in the last year and a half, but worries about where it goes from here.
I think a great crisis is not a concern to Chinese people, generally speaking. I don't believe that this sovereign debt crisis will destroy euro or something, because the Europe integration process has been going on for more than 50 years. To roll back this process is not an option. And personally, I believe that this crisis would strengthen, not weaken, this Europe integration process. But for China, we have to think about one possibility. We have to think about one thing that used to be unthinkable, that the United States has accumulated such a large debt. And there are only limited ways to go out of this debt crisis. The first is to spend less, and that's called austerity measures in Greek crisis, right? And we have already found out what has happened to the Greeks after these austerity measures been announced. There are political backlash, there are street protests. So for the global powers like the United States, is it internally speaking, is it politically possible for example, American people to spend less, to accept any kind of austerity measures in the future? If that's politically unacceptable, there are very few choices left. One of them is to monetize your debt, right? That is inflation in some way. And that is a severe concern for Chinese decision makers.
Of course, you know what I will say next. The Americans would put it the other way. They would say, you ask, is it politically possible for us to spend less? Is it politically possible for the Chinese to spend more?
Actually, it has already been a declared policy of the state. The state has tried to do so many things to stimulate domestic consumption, but as everybody has found out, that it depends on whether we can install a reliable safety network, social safety network in the near future, and that's still an open question.
But also, people look at the financial system and say this is a system that plays a very big part in making the economy the way it is, because it is hard for smaller companies to raise money the usual way from the big state banks. They save all of their profits. That's one of the ways in which, one of the reasons that China has such a high savings rate overall. Those kind of reforms, do you think that the Chinese government is willing to undertake those, or is there still a concern that everything is coming at pressure from the US and therefore they don't want to do it because of the pressure?
No, I don't think it's a pressure thing. I think that the risks is too highly concentrated in the banking system if this model continues indefinitely into the future. Actually, this day, the banking system has been too much relied on, for example, the real estate market, because after the Chinese government installed the 4 trillion stimulus plan in late 2008, the majority of this the stimulus plan has been put into very limited sectors. One of them is the real estate market. And if the real estate market decline for 20 to 30%, then that would be some kind of disaster for Chinese banking system. So for our own safety, for our own benefit, we have to diversify the risks and of the old model. We have to find some other ways to finance our economy.
But people worry about a bubble. When you talk about precisely that vulnerability, it makes a lot of people here nervous because they've heard that kind of talk before and it didn't end well in other countries. Mm-hmm. People always say this time it's different, this is sustainable. Is that the government's main concern at the moment, this bubble, or is it the longer term issue?
If anything today keeps Chinese leaders awake at night, it is a housing bubble. And actually, the Chinese government has recently has just installed a series of measures to tighten up this sector. It has pumped up the land supply. It has tightened up the mortgage loans. But the Chinese government has not increased the interest rates, has not revalued RMB exchange rate. So the policy to tighten up, to contain the bubble, is industry specific. It's targeting the housing sector itself. It's not a macro policy change. And it has worked somehow so far. The housing price has stopped climbing, and actually has declined in the past several weeks. Dramatically, you can say that. But since 2002, the Chinese government has done this kind of things several times, has done these industry-specific measures to the housing sector several times. And each time, it worked for some time. And then the housing prices will come back, will resume the growth even more forcefully than before. Because the Chinese government is so reluctant to adjust the macro policy. It's just target the housing sector itself. So this time, the effect to curb this bubble is still an open question.
I think listening to that, people will feel, I guess what people have felt about China for quite a long time is that each time the policy challenge to single-handedly the government to control that sector and to manage this enormous country with its many challenges just seems, you sort of can't believe they will carry on pulling it off. Somehow they do pull it off, they pull off the balance. But the worry, I mean, if we go back to more sort of slightly more mundane matters, people here who are wanting to go into China or already operating in China, should they feel comfortable about the stability of the situation, or should they be still nervous that things could unravel? Because obviously that is still a concern in the government as well.
Yes, I think they have a huge concern over this, because people around the world are very much impressed by how effective the state intervention at the end of 2008 that was. But remember this, at the end of 2008, the Chinese government has virtually told everybody that you can spend money freely, and there will be no consequences to it. So that's the easiest thing in the world, right, to do, because everybody wants to spend, and the banking loan supply is unlimited. So that's why it has worked so beautifully in the past 18 months. But the hard part is to contain the excesses of these unlimited banking loans. And today the government is trying to deal with specific trouble like housing sector bubble, but it is still not decided on whether to deal with the macro policy change. And I think they may be wrong to act too late.
Well, Marcus, it's a good moment to bring you in. There's an echo. The Chinese challenge is obviously a version of the global challenge. Much easier to turn the taps on at a time of unprecedented crisis than to know exactly when to turn them off, especially when you have some of the experience of the early 30s, look back on, which was also after this kind of banking crisis. What's it looking like for you, that going back to the sort of dodging a bullet or the bullet suspended in midair?
How was it? Well, the short answer is it was frightening. It was very frightening because in the depths of the crisis, there was a total collapse of confidence. And no one knew what to believe. No one knew who to trust. They all put their heads back in their burrows. And it was very, very frightening. What we had to do, and I don't know whether this feeds across the Chinese situation, was it's quite clear that doing nothing was not an option. Just sitting there and shaking was not going to get us anywhere. And so speaking parochially in Barclays, what we found we had to do was to make a series of very big calls in terms of capital raising, selling assets, strengthening our balance sheet, regaining the confidence of the market. But we did those things, and eventually it worked. But if we hadn't done that, then the consequences would have been pretty negative.
But when you look at the challenge now, and the system, the fear then was that we wouldn't fix the banking system quickly enough. Now, it's almost people are worried that we're trying to fix the banking system too fast, that in order to, because you're being pressured to take on, to build up your capital, all of these things, is actually a risk to the economy,
yes.
to the global economy.
And that's a genuine concern, because what tends to happen whenever there's a crisis, the solution tends to be an overreaction, and it's in human nature, I think, and therefore people like me have to do what we can to try and persuade people not to overreact. And the point's a good one, because if you again listen to the common thread in these various different conversations, everyone is wondering where the money is going to come from. How are we going to get out of this global mess? Forget the UK. And the answer at the end of the day has to come out of economic growth. Has to come out of economic growth. It's what sustained the development of the world in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's been this great long boom which eventually boiled over, but it did do a huge amount of good on the way up. And if we want in the future to look to a restoration of growth, it is absolutely essential that we have strong, well-capitalized, healthy banks. And that's not a self-serving statement, it's a statement of fact. So therefore, if the rush to solve the problem that occurred previously is to overburden the financial system with forcing people to carry too much liquidity, too much capital, control the way in which they lend, that's not going to solve the problem. There's a danger it's going to make things worse. Now, I don't want to sound too self-serving, because I think the policymakers absolutely understand this, and I think and I hope that what changes are going to come in are going to be proportionate, and in particular are going to be exercised over a sufficiently long time frame that they won't have that damaging effect. But that's the trade-off. You can have you can have a super safe system and damage the prospects of economic growth, or you can have a more realistic correction and hopefully lay the groundwork for the restoration of economic growth.
Now, this isn't a panel about reforming the financial system, thank goodness in many ways.
Hooray.
But you can very rapidly get too into the weeds on these things. But for the people here who sort of check in and out of these debates and know that there's this ongoing reform effort in the US, and now a new government here committed to, on paper, slightly more radical change than the previous government. It's sort of big picture, what are your fears? Do you think it is going in the right direction?
Well, my fear is that we're going to fragment international coordination. I think one of the great events of the last 2 or 3 years has been the evolution of the G20. I think that the previous global governance structure wasn't appropriate. I think the G20 is if we can make it work, is a great evolution, a great development. And there is a process in play. There is a phased analysis of the problems. There's the construction of a series of measures to help correct the need for global financial reform, which I absolutely accept the need for. But the concern is that people will lose patience, nations will lose patience, nations will get competitive, and we'll end up with a situation where you have a ragtag structure around the world, which will simply create anomalies. And the world, one of the things that is absolutely crystal clear that coming out of the last 2 or 3 years is how small the world has become and how interconnected it is. And what started with what many people thought was a little local problem in the subprime market in America led to a financial crisis which engulfed the entire world to a greater or lesser extent. And therefore, what I hope for is that somehow politicians can hold their nerve, politicians and regulators can hold their nerve, and we can build towards some kind of global system through the G20 process.
I guess a lot of people would listen to you. I mean, I should say you're one of the bankers who's willing to come out in daylight these days. But
that's been a problem.
But a lot of people would say bankers, and particularly in the financial institutions in general, just don't get it. Mm-hmm. And they would see an example in the way that Goldman Sachs has responded to this recent case. And they can come out and regardless of the details of the case, they are basically arguing that this is something they were legally allowed to do, and they should be carrying on doing it. And I think the response of the public is, well, if it was the legal way to do things, we don't want it to be the legal way anymore, because we think it's ethically troubling to create instruments for one part that you know are going to be bet against by another party.
Yeah, I don't want to get into the individual circumstances in that case, but what I would say is that the banking industry has done a rotten job over the last 2 or 3 years at helping people to understand what it's for and why it's important, and the fact that it does have a social utility. And in consequence, a number
not God's work, presumably.
Not God's work, of course not God's work. But I mean, the fact is that, as I said before, economies cannot exist without a banking system, and international development cannot exist without global banks. And therefore, we need to make the case in a much better and much more effective way than we have in the past. And we need to do that because a number of myths have grown up, like all investment banks only ever engage in some glorified form of gambling. Not true. Like borrowing in the UK economy has gone down, the banks clearly aren't lending, whereas in fact, what's happened is that very sensible businessmen have decided to, in the face of an economic crisis, to pay down their debt and to pull in their horns. So that the level of borrowing has gone down because of a lack of demand, not because of a lack of supply, and so on. I can give you many other examples. But the fact is that these myths have been allowed to become quasi-fact, and we simply have to, as an industry, steadily and slowly do what we can to make sure people do understand and get the right picture.
But
not easy.
Perhaps it's because we did start this morning with Desmond Tutu, but I would like to keep on with this sort of ethical issue, because I think there's also an economic issue here. The old line is, capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. And we've sort of had a long period where a lot of institutions, particularly financial institutions, were not allowed to go bankrupt because of the consequences for the broader economy. Isn't that a risk? Are we really going to regain a sort of capitalism into red and tooth and claw?
I think there's a wider point, which is that every bank since time began basically borrows short and lends long, and that, if you think about it, is inherently unstable. It only exists because people who deal with banks have confidence in the banks, and therefore they feel that their money is safe when they make a deposit, and they feel they're quite safe in dealing with that bank. Confidence and trust are absolute bedfellows. And if we as an industry lose the trust, if our reputation is damaged because of various things, then that confidence is eroded. And the two do absolutely go hand in hand. So what we have to do is we have to earn back the trust of the politicians and of the common man.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how far are you toward that goal, do you think?
I'd like to think we were above 5, but right now I'm not certain. It's a big job.
Dennis Turner, Chief Economist for HSBC, but I'm not going to be asking you specifically about the banking per se, and maybe even bringing it closer to home. But what are the big risks that you see looking forward? Are we truly back from the brink, or do you think there are still serious worries?
Well, I think in purely UK terms, I'd support the view that we're probably just about through the worst. I think we understand the problem, we understand where it went wrong, we know what we have to do. But that is still some way short of business as usual. And I think there's a slow climb uphill to get from where we are to where we want to be. And I got quite depressed during the election campaign in the extent to which our economy was talked down. About the only advantage I think age confers on people is a sense of perspective. And there is a tendency now to think this is the worst since Adam was a lad. But if you've lived in the UK as long as I have, you go back to 1979 and you'd say that was when it was bad. Now, we managed that, we came through it, we knew what we had to do, we did it, and it worked. Now, I think we get our arms around the extent of the problems today. I think policymakers probably could have been criticised for the contribution to the recessionary environment. I think there were serious policy errors 4 or 5 years ago. But once the recession kicked in, I think the policy response has been unprecedented. And I think going forward, there is a measure of agreement on what needs to be done. So I think the risks are not that we don't understand what to do and our willingness to do it, but in fact, external risks are probably much greater.
Going back to this question of where the growth's going to come from, and that's what would concern many people in this room.
Absolutely.
Now, you focus on the UK, but the UK situation in some ways parallels the US situation. Where is the growth going to come from?
Well, at its simplest level, you'd say we've plunged into a deep recession in the UK because we relied disproportionately for growth, jobs and profits on consumers who spend and borrow too much and governments which spend and borrow too much. And what we didn't do enough of were the other bits of the economy, the investment and the exports. Now, if you're going to rebalance the economy and come out of this recession with something that looks like sustainable growth, then we have to focus on the bits we ignored before. And if you talk about investing and you talk about exports, you're actually back to manufacturing. And it has a pivotal role to play in our economy.
What on earth can this incoming government do about that?
Well, first of all, the point is that the point well worth making is that people say we're not a manufacturing economy anymore. Well, when you look at the numbers, it's pretty clear that we are. British manufacturing output reached its historic peak, not in 1856 or 1928, but actually in 2006. So we're still a manufacturing economy. It's changed. Where we used to do bulk, we now do added value. Where we used to do cheap, we now do smart. So we have a very good manufacturing base. We'd just like it to be a bit bigger and to tilt the economy away from financial services, property and construction, distribution, towards a more productive enterprise. And the government's role for that, I think, is a much more, what might be described as an enabling role. Government can't do it. I don't think you expect medium-sized companies to become large, but it might be worth having another look at what people would have called in the 1990s the Michael Heseltine agenda, is to ask what we need to do, who does it best, and what can we do to persuade these companies to be in the UK.
But that was exactly what, if you talk to Labour ministers in the last 10 years,
They
they
lost
were
sight
under
of
the
it.
impression they were doing just that.
And
They would
lost
go
sight
on
of,
and on to you about
They
it.
lost sight of it totally. What we need is the next generation of Nissans to come in, perhaps another HSBC to come in, not necessarily in financial services, but these countries, these large multinational companies, global players, looked at the UK and said it was a great place to do business. And once they were here, the benefits are enormous.
Can we do any of that with a Eurozone economy that's flat on its back?
No,
desperately trying to
I mean,
cut deficits?
I said the risks are external. What worries me is that when you look at global growth, you'd say it's the BRIC economies that matter. Britain depends on its export growth. It's slightly unnerving to find that Greece is a bigger export market than Brazil for the UK. It shouldn't be. And if we're serious about export growth, then we do need not just to do more, but we need to refocus and rebalance the export markets. And I also think there's some evidence at the moment we have this enormous advantage of a very competitive exchange rate. But many British companies, for very understandable reasons, are choosing to keep the same sterling price and rebuild margins rather than cut price and increase market share. So there is a risk there that we may fritter away this one-off benefit of a competitive exchange rate.
On that encouraging note, I think we might try and bring in a few questions. As I suggested at the beginning, we've covered a ridiculous amount of ground in terms of the global economic situation, but as you can tell, we've got some formidable insight here on any number of issues for anyone who had a question. I think just while you're thinking of them, I wondered, Marcus, whether you had, sitting in a slightly different place in the UK, do you have a response or a view on some of the things that Dennis has said? I mean, specifically, whether this new government has important things that it must do, whether it's in the financial system or the broader economy, or whether it really just needs to back off.
No, I think Derek was right on the money. And one of the things, and the weekend before last was one of the more extraordinary weekends for anyone who's interested in UK politics. I'm still not quite certain what to make of it myself, but what is quite clear is that we have a new government, and after 13 years, that's always a healthy sign, because the new government has energy, it has a mandate, it can do things that the outgoing government would find much more difficult to do. And what I just hope that they will have the wit to do some of the things that Derek described, because I think there is an opportunity here which we should try and grab with both our hands.
I'd also echo Marcus's point that the obsession with the debt and reducing the deficit may lead the policymakers to concentrate on those taxes which generate the most revenue, when in fact you've got to ask the question, what conditions do you need to stimulate growth? And medium to long term, it's got to be growth that gets us out of trouble. It's not a casino economy where you just pull a slot lever in order to generate the most short-term cash.
Add to this, I think we have some degree of complementarity here, since for Russia, technological imports from UK, from Germany, from other countries in Europe, a very important component of our policy. We do not have sufficient level of technological events right now just to close down and to do it on our own. We need exports of equipment, of know-how from those countries, and those countries will grow on the basis of this incremental exports to Russia. But generally speaking, certainly there is no this navigation lady saying that you should turn right now, and we will have to find the right rules of the game to provide incentives for people to start doing that.
But if this is when, I mean, as you know well from your G20 discussions, you have everyone around the table claiming that they're going to export their way to a recovery. I think countries that are responsible for 80% of global GDP want to export their way to recovery, which unless we start exporting to Mars, is not going to happen.
Well, we are not sure that everyone will survive with exports, but certainly Russia needs more imports, and I guess that some other countries also do. But without the increase in domestic demand and also in some of the domestic investment demand in particular, in some of the developed countries, nothing will happen.
Are any, yeah.
Tim Lefroy from the Advertising Association here in the UK. With such talent sitting here on the panel, it would almost be irresponsible not to ask what are the reasonable prospects for controlling inflation in this economy, what your forecasts are, and where that's likely to take bank interest rates.
Actually, before I do that, I think that's a great question. And I just want to do it's a test, which I've done with similarly illustrious audiences, just between whether you think the major risk in the next few years for your business is going to be deflation or inflation. Hands up people who think the major risk for the next few years is deflation. That's probably a lot less than a year ago. And inflation. So what do you think? Dennis,
I'd be nervous about inflation. I'd be nervous because of the weaker exchange rate, because of global growth and dependence on imports. I don't see that much risk from traditional domestically generated inflation, i.e. wage claims. I mean, I think there's enough slack in the system to allow quite a lot of growth before we start seeing those domestic pressures building. But the importing inflation, I think, is quite serious. I'd also like, it's a slightly techie point, but I would like to see the Bank of England being given an inflation target that adequately represented what was happening in the economy. Let's get housing back in the measure.
Which gets back to broader debates about
yes, it does
things.
indeed.
So, Wang, Shuo, I mean, to some extent, inflation is already, as we know, is already an issue, and we were just discussing it in China. Yeah. But is your worry that they won't get on top of it? Do you think? Sorry, just to go to Wang Shuo.
Sorry.
Actually, the deflation, inflation thing, I think it could be as some part of the world is in the real danger of inflation, and some part of the world don't face this danger, maybe face the danger of deflation. The developed economies, I think today, don't face serious challenge of inflation in the near future. But for the emerging market like China, India, Brazil, the inflation is a very clear danger, already been there. And this is because the major economies, the United States, the Europe, has an extremely low interest rate policy there, and it will last for extended period in the future. And so the global liquidity just flow from the major economy to the emerging markets, especially China and other countries. And for us, the inflation challenge, the challenge of inflation and also asset bubble are very difficult for us to contain by ourselves. Yes, we can and we should revalue RMB, and we should increase the interest rate. But without do something about the origin of this global liquidity back in United States and Europe, what we can do in China is quite limited.
Arkady, inflation?
Well, for us, coming from double-digit inflation to single-digit inflation was a change already, and certainly in the well, right now we have 6% per annum, which is lowest level over the last 20 years for Russia. And certainly in the coming few months we are worrying about deflation given this level, so, since we still have substantial increase in energy price in the domestic market. So if you take out energy prices, the rest is actually not going up. The rest is almost zero. So we're worrying a little bit about deflation in the coming months. But if you take a medium-term perspective, it's inflation that is still excessive in Russia, and we worry about inflation more about.
I think,
about
I mean,
inflation.
Marcus, for anyone in the financial markets, I've heard it a lot more this year with regard to the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England in particular, knowing the upside for those countries of a bit of inflation when it comes to what it could do to some of those debt dynamics and making it easier to cut public spending, making an awful lot of things easier. Do you think the risk is there?
You're right to be cynical. I mean, absolutely right to be cynical.
Sceptical, I would say, rather.
Well, skeptical, whichever, skeptical or cynical, because if you're a politician, there is that silver lining to that particular cloud. And I don't think I know the answer as to how dangerous a risk inflation is. But like Dennis, I was around in the 70s, and I remember how ghastly inflation was then and how it absolutely undermined the very fabric of society, and therefore what a great danger it is. And I am somewhat concerned because every time I have asked the question that you just asked of economists around the place, they're all unbelievably blithe, saying, don't worry, we'll be able to handle that when it comes. And if so many people say it in those terms, it leaves me cynically or skeptically to believe that probably it's not quite as easy as all that. So I think it's the right question to ask and to keep asking.
Well, I think I've slightly confirmed, or we've slightly confirmed what I said at the start, was that sense that we're back from the brink, but it's definitely still there. And you've had, just in the last few minutes, a few new things to worry about on your list. Any of you hasn't read, I've just recently read Dr. Doom, Nouriel Roubini's new book. And you might be disturbed to discover that you read all about the crisis, but page 255, you discover that he doesn't think we've had the big one yet. He thinks it's still to come. So certainly reasons to worry, but thank you very much to all the panelists. After the break, you will have Chrystia Freeland, my former colleague at the Financial Times, who's now the editor-in-large at Reuters, so I think you're all very familiar with. But enjoy your coffee in the meantime, and thank you to the guests.